Do you think, Kevin, based on what you found in your research, that in some cases he has been unfairly maligned? I think you drew an interesting parallel in the book with Justice Thurgood Marshall. And you talked about the way some people describe Justice Marshall when he was on the bench, and they use those same terms to describe Justice Thomas. Is there some truth in what he says, that maybe he has been unfairly maligned?
Yeah, I would call that our counterintuitive chapter, to direct people to chapter 14, because I think in most venues, people would find not a scintilla of likeness between Justice Thomas and Marshall. In fact, in their jurisprudence and in their approach to the Constitution, and there would not be similarities. And yet, as black men, I think that you found a lot in terms of the critics. They were both treated much the same way by the critics. I mean, Justice Marshall was always said to be the one to follow Brennan. They were the two liberal stalwarts in the court, but it was never Brennan who was following Marshall. It was always Marshall who was the lesser light. They said about Thurgood Marshall that he didn't do his work, that the clerks did most of his work. If you read The Brethren by my colleague Bob Woodward, one of his early great books with Scott Armstrong, I mean, Thurgood Marshall's portrayed as somebody who, particularly in his later years, was drinking a lot, wasn't bringing the intellectual heft to the court that others were. They say much the same about Justice Thomas, that he follows Scalia, that he doesn't do much of his own work because he's silent on the court. He's not as smart as his colleagues. And I think in that way there are some similarities. There are others too, because Justice Thomas has been very harsh with the prominent against the prominent activists of his day, the civil rights establishment, the Jesse Jacksons, the Al Sharptons. But Thurgood Marshall was also very critical of Malcolm X and other of the militants who, at the time, thought that Thurgood Marshall was someone who was maybe a little bit out of step, and yet he was probably responsible, more responsible than any human being ever for the legal dismantling of Jim Crow. And so, they often found themselves at odds. But of course, in the main arena where it counts in terms of their judicial philosophy, they were wildly apart, and Thurgood Marshall certainly was disappointed that Clarence Thomas was the one that took his seat.